My name is Emma Richardson and I'm 28 years old. Have you ever watched your own father choose money over love right in front of your eyes last New Year's Eve? I sat at the back table of his fancy party like some unwanted guest, while he handed my inheritance to my stepsister. When he raised his champagne glass and declared that only children who make him proud deserve the family name, then looked straight at me and said I didn't belong there, I thought my heart would shatter. 300 people witnessed my humiliation. I was ready to walk out and never speak to him again. But then something incredible happened. My quiet, humble fiancé David stood up, and what he revealed about himself in the next 60 seconds changed not just my life, but destroyed my father's empire forever. If you think you know how this story ends, trust me, you have no idea what's coming. Let me take you back to where it began. Have you ever been completely erased from your own family's story in front of hundreds of people last New Year's Eve? My father raised his champagne glass at the most important party of his life and declared that only children who make him proud deserve to carry our family name. Then he looked straight at me and said I didn't belong there. What happened next when my fiancé stood up and revealed who he really was changed everything in 60 seconds. But let me start from the beginning of that day, December 31st, when I had no idea my entire life was about to turn upside down. I was standing in my little Denver apartment bathroom at 7 in the morning, trying to figure out what you wear when you know you're walking into a family firing squad. My name is Emma Richardson, I'm 28 years old, and I teach second grade at Lincoln Elementary. Not exactly the career that impresses at my father's annual New Year's Eve extravaganza at the Grand Hyatt Ballroom. David, my fiancé, knocked softly on the bathroom door. We'd been together 2 years engaged for 6 months, and he still had this gentle way of checking on me that made my heart skip. Come in, I called, holding up 2 dresses. The navy blue or the black. He leaned against the doorframe looking handsome in his morning sweats, dark hair still messy from sleep. David worked in tech consulting, drove a nice Tesla Model S, lived in a beautiful downtown condo. Successful enough, but nothing that would impress my construction mogul father or my stepmother Victoria's social climbing standards. The Navy, he said without hesitation. It brings out your eyes. Plus, you look confident in it. Confident. That's what I needed tonight. My phone buzzed on the counter with a text from Victoria, my stepmother of 4 years. Bring appropriate attire for David tonight, considering the business associates attending. We want to make the right impression. I showed David the message. He read it, jaw tightening slightly. What does she mean by appropriate attire? He asked. She means you're not good enough for their precious social circle, I muttered, then immediately felt bad. I'm sorry, that was harsh. David's phone started ringing. He glanced at it, declined the call. Work, he said. They can wait. But it rang again immediately. This time he answered, walking into the bedroom. Chen speaking. Yes, I understand the timeline. The announcement is confirmed for tonight. Good. No changes to the documentation. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but something about his tone was different. More authoritative than usual. Major project wrapping up, I asked when he returned. Something like that, he said, but his expression was unreadable. Are you nervous about tonight? Terrified was more accurate. Every year, my father, William Richardson, threw this massive New Year's Eve party to show off his construction company's success. 300 guests, all the important people in Denver's business world, and somehow I always felt like I was there by mistake. It's just Amanda will be there, I said, referring to my stepsister Victoria's daughter. She made partner at Morrison & Associates last month. Dad's been bragging about it to everyone. David pulled me close. Amanda being successful doesn't make you less successful. You're Teacher of the Year, Emma. You've transformed dozens of kids' lives. Try telling that to my family. Last year at Christmas dinner, Victoria spent 2 hours talking about Amanda's courtroom victories, while my teaching award sat on the counter, never mentioned once. My phone rang. Mrs. Patterson, one of my students' mothers. Emma, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling so early. I wanted to give you a heads up about tonight. I saw Victoria at the Black Hawk Casino last Wednesday. She looked upset, kept checking her phone, seemed really stressed about something. Mrs. Patterson worked as a cocktail waitress there part-time. She was always looking out for me. Thanks for letting me know, I said, though I wasn't sure what to make of it. Just be careful tonight, sweetie. Something felt off about the whole scene. After I hung up, David was watching me carefully. Everything okay? Victoria's been gambling again, I think. Mrs. Patterson saw her at the casino looking worried. David's phone buzzed with another call. He glanced at it, declined again. Busy morning at work, I asked. You could say that. He kissed my forehead. Whatever happens tonight, remember that your worth isn't determined by their approval. I wished I believed that as much as he seemed to. By 6 o'clock, we were driving downtown in David's Tesla. The Grand Hyatt rose above us, every window glowing with warm light. Valets in red uniforms rushed to open our doors, and I noticed something strange. The head valet took one look at David and immediately straightened up. Good evening, Mr. Chen, the valet said with unusual deference. We have your preferred parking spot reserved. David tipped him generously. Thank you, Marcus. That's very thoughtful. I looked at David curiously as we walked toward the entrance. You know him. I've been here for business meetings, David said casually, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. The hotel lobby sparkled with New Year's decorations. Gold and silver streamers hung from crystal chandeliers, and I could hear the buzz of conversation from the ballroom ahead. My stomach twisted with familiar anxiety. Then I saw the hotel manager approaching us with a wide smile. Mr. Chen, what a pleasure. Your usual suite is ready if you need anything this evening. Please let us know how we can make tonight special for you and your lovely fiancé. David shook his hand warmly. Thank you, James. We appreciate the hospitality. As we walked away, I grabbed David's arm. Your usual suite. How often are you here for business? Often enough that they remember me, he said. But before I could ask more questions, I heard my stepmother's voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. Emma, darling, you made it. And David, how nice that you could join us. Victoria Richardson glided toward us in a glittering gold gown that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her smile was perfect, cold, and completely fake. Behind her, my father approached in his best tuxedo, looking every inch the successful businessman he'd worked so hard to become. But it was the way the hotel staff continued to nod respectfully at David as we passed that made me realize my quiet, humble fiancé might not be quite as ordinary as I thought. The Grand Hyatt ballroom took my breath away just like it did every year. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light over round tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a masterpiece of white orchids and gold accents. 300 guests mingled beneath soaring ceilings, the cream of Denver society dressed in their finest. This wasn't just a New Year's Eve party. This was my father's annual showcase of success, his chance to prove that William Richardson had made it to the top of the construction world. But walking into that room, I felt like I was wearing a neon sign that said, I don't belong here. Emma, there you are. Mrs. Patterson appeared at my elbow with her warm smile. She looked elegant in a simple black dress, her graying hair styled perfectly. I was so happy when I saw your name on the guest list. You remember my husband Tom, don't you? Of course, I said, hugging them both. Mrs. Patterson had been fighting for better resources at Lincoln Elementary for years. Her daughter Sarah was one of my brightest students last year. We were just telling the Hendersons about your reading program, Tom said proudly. 30% improvement in test scores. That's incredible. David stepped closer, his hand finding the small of my back in that protective way I loved. The Hendersons, whose son Michael had struggled with dyslexia until Emma worked with him, shook David's hand warmly. You're a lucky man, Mr. Henderson told David. Teachers like Emma change lives. My boy went from hating books to reading 3 levels above grade level. I felt a flush of pride, but it was quickly interrupted by Victoria's voice, cutting through our conversation like a cold wind. Emma, sweetie, we need to get you seated. The program is starting soon, and we have some very important announcements tonight. She glided over in her gold sequined gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. Behind her came Amanda, my 29-year-old stepsister, looking absolutely stunning in a designer red dress that probably cost more than my car payment. Her blonde hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Mom, you remember Mrs. Patterson, don't you?" Amanda said with practiced charm. "How lovely to see you again." But Victoria was already steering me away from the group. "Emma, darling, you and David are at table 12. It's a wonderful spot with all the other educators. I thought you'd feel more comfortable there, table 12. I glanced around the ballroom and spotted it near the back, partially hidden behind a decorative column. Meanwhile, the head table gleamed under the chandelier, directly in front of the stage, with place cards that read William Richardson, Victoria Richardson, Amanda Morrison, and Brandon Mitchell. Brandon Mitchell, Amanda's fiancé of Judge Robert Mitchell, one of the most influential families in Colorado. They'd announced their engagement 3 months ago, and my father had thrown them a celebration party that made tonight's event look modest. "Amanda, congratulations again on making partner Mrs. Patterson said kindly. "That's quite an achievement at such a young age." "Thank you, Amanda," replied her smile radiant. "It's been a whirlwind few months. Between the promotion and planning the wedding, I can barely keep up. Brandon's family has been so supportive. His father's law firm handles some major corporate clients." She glanced at me meaningfully. "Of course, we all have different definitions of success, don't we? Some people are meant for boardrooms, others for classrooms." The words stung, but before I could respond, a distinguished older man approached our group. "Amanda Morrison, isn't it Judge Mitchell told me to keep an eye out for you tonight? Nathan Brooks, family attorney? Your father and I have some business to discuss this evening." He was carrying a leather folder thick with documents. Victoria's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Perfect timing, Nathan. We're ready to finalize everything tonight. New year, new priorities. As William always says." David had been quietly observing this exchange, but I noticed his posture change, slightly becoming more alert. "Finalize what I asked," but Victoria was already guiding Nathan toward the head table. "Just some family business, dear. Nothing for you to worry about. Why don't you get settled at your table?" As we walked toward table 12, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being orchestrated around me. David squeezed my hand. "You okay? Do you ever feel like everyone else got a script for life and you're just improvising?" I asked. "Every day," he said softly. "But sometimes the people who are improvising are the most authentic." Table 12 was indeed filled with educators. 3 elementary teachers, 2 high school principals, and a school counselor, all lovely people who greeted us warmly. But I couldn't help noticing how far we were from the action, how the important conversations were happening 300 feet away at the head table. Mrs. Patterson leaned over from the neighboring table. "Emma, did you know your father's company got that big contract for the new downtown development? The one that's been in the papers all year?" "No," I said, realizing how little I knew about my father's business these days. "He never talked to me about work anymore." "Huge project," Tom added. "Partnering with some tech company, bringing a lot of high-profile investors to Denver." David's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it, typed a quick response, then put it away. But I caught a glimpse of the message preview before he closed it. "Final confirmation needed by midnight." "Important client?" I asked. You could say that David replied, but his attention was focused on the head table where Nathan Brooks was spreading documents across the white tablecloth, while my father and Victoria huddled around him, their heads bent together in intense conversation. Amanda stood nearby, radiant in her red dress, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of guests. Every few minutes my father would introduce her to another business associate, his voice carrying across the room with obvious pride. "This is my daughter Amanda, partner at Morrison & Associates, Harvard Law, youngest partner in the firm's history. She represents everything we hope to achieve in the Richardson family." I'd heard variations of this speech a dozen times tonight already. Each introduction felt like another weight added to my chest, pressing down until I could barely breathe. David must have sensed my distress because he reached for my hand under the table. "Your students' parents think you walk on water," he murmured. "Their respect is worth more than all the business cards being exchanged up there." I wanted to believe him, but watching my father beam with pride as Amanda charmed another potential client, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was witnessing a preview of something much bigger than social awkwardness. Something that would change everything forever. The evening grew more surreal as dinner progressed. Amanda worked the room like a seasoned politician, her red dress catching the light as she moved gracefully from table to table. I watched her introduce herself to Denver's power brokers with the kind of confidence I'd never possessed. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my daughter Amanda," my father announced to a group of city councilmen. "She just closed the Morrison case, saved the city $12 million in potential liability." This is what the Richardson name stands for. The men nodded, approvingly shaking Amanda's hand with obvious respect. One of them handed her a business card. "We could use someone with your expertise on the Municipal Development Committee," he said. "Judge Mitchell speaks very highly of your work." "That would be wonderful," Amanda replied smoothly. "I believe in giving back to the community that's given me so much." I took a sip of wine and tried not to feel invisible. At our table, the conversation had turned to budget cuts in education, something I knew plenty about. But nobody from the head table came over to ask for my opinion on that. David leaned closer. "You're grinding your teeth," he murmured. "Am I?" I touched my jaw, surprised. I hadn't realized. "This family dynamic is toxic," he said quietly. "You know that?" Right before I could answer, Victoria appeared beside our table with that fake smile she'd perfected over the years. "Emma, sweetie, I hate to interrupt, but your father needs the seating chart adjusted. We have some last-minute VIP arrivals, and we need to make room at the better tables." Better tables. As if our location wasn't already clear enough. "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where would you like us to move?" "Oh, you're fine where you are," Victoria said with a dismissive wave. "It's perfect for the education crowd. I meant we need to move some of the business associates closer to the front." She gestured to the head table where Nathan Brooks was still bent over his documents. I noticed his briefcase was monogrammed with Richardson Construction's logo. "What kind of business are you and Dad finalizing tonight?" I asked. "Just some restructuring, dear. William's been thinking about succession planning, making sure the company's future is secure." "You understand?" Actually, I didn't understand. Nobody had mentioned anything about succession planning to me. David's phone buzzed again. This time when he checked it, I saw his expression change subtly. He typed back quickly, then put the phone face down on the table. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Just confirming some details for Monday," he said, but something in his tone had shifted. There was an edge of authority I rarely heard. From across the room, Judge Mitchell approached the head table with his wife, an elegant woman in navy blue. Brandon stood to greet his parents, and I watched Amanda transform into the perfect future daughter-in-law, gracious and charming. "Robert Eleanor, how wonderful to see you," my father boomed, shaking the judge's hand enthusiastically. "Brandon's been telling us about your family's law firm. Impressive client roster." "We do all right," Judge Mitchell replied modestly. "Brandon tells us Amanda's made quite a name for herself in corporate law." "She has indeed," Victoria interjected, practically glowing with pride. "Harvard Law Review youngest partner at Morrison & Associates. We couldn't be more proud." I realized I was gripping my napkin so tightly my knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Patterson reached over from the next table and patted my arm gently. "Your Teacher of the Year ceremony was beautiful, honey. I still have the photos on my refrigerator. Sarah talks about your class every day. That's sweet of you to say I managed." "You know," Mrs. Patterson continued, "I ran into your father at the grocery store last month. I mentioned how proud he must be of your award, and the strangest thing happened. He just changed the subject completely. Started talking about Amanda's engagement instead." My stomach dropped. Even grocery store small talk couldn't include my accomplishments. David must have sensed my distress because he stood up abruptly. "I'm going to get some air," he said. Emma, want to come with me? We stepped out onto the hotel's terrace where the December air was crisp and clean. Downtown Denver sparkled below us, the city lights reflecting off the snow-covered mountains in the distance. I can't do this anymore, I said, wrapping my arms around myself. I feel like I'm disappearing right in front of everyone. You're not disappearing, David said firmly. You're just surrounded by people who are too blind to see what's right in front of them. His phone rang. He glanced at it, hesitated, then answered. Chen speaking. Yes, I got your message. The documentation is ready, good. And the media contacts are confirmed, perfect. I'll be in touch after midnight. He hung up and caught me staring at him. Media contacts, I asked. David, what kind of tech consulting do you actually do? The kind that sometimes requires discretion, he said carefully. Emma, there are things about my work I haven't told you. Not because I don't trust you, but because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I do. Before I could ask what he meant, Victoria appeared in the doorway. Emma, we're starting the toast soon. Your father has something very important to announce, and the whole family needs to be present. Something about her expression made my blood run cold. This wasn't going to be another boring speech about construction contracts and business partnerships. This was going to change everything. As we walked back into the ballroom, I noticed Nathan Brooks gathering his papers, sliding them into a neat stack. Whatever documents he'd brought tonight, they were ready to be presented. And judging by Victoria's satisfied smile, I was about to find out exactly what my place in the Richardson family really was. The ballroom fell silent as my father stepped up to the microphone at the front of the room. 300 guests turned their attention toward the head table champagne glasses glinting under the crystal chandeliers. I felt David's hand find mine under the table, warm and steady, but my palms were already starting to sweat. Good evening, everyone. My father began, his voice carrying that commanding tone he'd perfected over 30 years of running Richardson Construction. As we prepare to welcome a new year, I want to take this opportunity to discuss something very important to Victoria and me. The future of our family legacy. My heart started pounding. This wasn't the usual business update or thank you speech. Nathan Brooks stood beside the head table, that leather folder of documents in his hands, ready for whatever came next. For those who don't know my father, continued Richardson, construction has experienced unprecedented growth this year. We've secured contracts worth over $50 million, and we're positioned to expand into markets across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I noticed several business associates nodding approvingly, but my attention was fixed on Victoria's expression of barely contained excitement. This success requires careful planning for the future, Dad, said, his eyes scanning the room. It requires leaders who understand what it means to build something lasting, something meaningful. Leaders who share our vision and our values. Amanda stood gracefully, her red dress catching the light perfectly. Even from across the room, she radiated confidence and poise. As many of you know, my stepdaughter Amanda has achieved remarkable success in her legal career. Partner at Morrison & Associates at 29 Harvard Law Review, with a client roster that includes some of Colorado's most prominent families. The applause was warmer this time, more enthusiastic. Judge Mitchell beamed with obvious approval as Brandon squeezed Amanda's hand. Amanda represents everything the Richardson name stands for, my father declared. Excellence, ambition, and the drive to succeed at the highest levels. Which is why Victoria and I have made some important decisions about our family's future. My stomach dropped. The room felt like it was tilting sideways. After careful consideration and consultation with our attorneys, Dad announced we've restructured our succession plans to reflect our family's priorities. Amanda will be positioned as the primary beneficiary of Richardson Construction, with full authority to carry our legacy forward. The words hit me like a physical blow. Primary beneficiary. Full authority. I was being written out of my own family's future in front of 300 people. Nathan Brooks stepped forward with his documents, and I realized they weren't just papers, they were legal blueprints for my erasure. Of course, we want to support all of our children, Dad continued, his eyes finally finding mine across the room. Emma will receive a modest educational fund to support her teaching career. We believe everyone should pursue their appropriate level of contribution. Appropriate level of contribution. The phrase was a knife sharp and precise. Mrs. Patterson reached across from her table and squeezed my arm, her face flushed with indignation. The other teachers at my table looked uncomfortable, embarrassed to be witnessing such a public dismissal. David's grip on my hand tightened, and when I glanced at him, his expression was darker than I'd ever seen it. This arrangement reflects our family's commitment to proven success, Victoria added, rising to stand beside my father. Some people are naturally suited for leadership roles, while others find fulfillment in service positions. We're simply acknowledging those natural differences. Service positions. Like teaching was some kind of charitable hobby instead of a profession that required a master's degree and shaped the next generation. Amanda accepted congratulations graciously, but I noticed she wasn't meeting my eyes. Even she looked uncomfortable with how brutal this announcement had become. The legal documentation will be finalized next week, Nathan Brooks announced, holding up his folder. Mr. Richardson wanted to make these intentions public tonight, so everyone understands the family's direction moving forward. Understanding crashed over me like a cold wave. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. This was about my father's public declaration that I didn't matter, that my life's work had no value, that I was a disappointment he was ready to minimize and forget. I felt physically sick. 28 years of trying to earn his approval, of hoping that someday he'd see my accomplishments as worthy of respect, and this was his answer. A modest educational fund, and a polite dismissal in front of everyone who mattered in his world. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Several heads turned our direction, but he didn't seem to care. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "This has gone far enough." "David, don't," I whispered, pulling on his arm. "Please don't make a scene." But he was already moving, walking with purpose toward the head table. The entire ballroom watched as he approached my father, Nathan Brooks, and Victoria. Whatever was about to happen, I knew there would be no going back. My father looked annoyed by the interruption, but something about David's demeanor made him pause. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, and Nathan Brooks clutched his documents a little tighter. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," David said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "About appropriate levels of contribution." My father stared at David with obvious irritation, clearly not used to being interrupted during his important announcements. The 300 guests watched in uncomfortable silence as David stood calmly beside the head table, his presence somehow commanding attention despite his modest appearance. "Young man, I don't believe we've been properly introduced," my father said, his voice carrying that dismissive tone he used with people he considered beneath his notice. "I'm in the middle of addressing my guests." "David Chen," David replied evenly, "Emma's fiancé, and I think your guests would be very interested in hearing about appropriate levels of contribution." Victoria stepped forward, her smile sharp as glass. "Mr. Chen, this is a family matter. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable returning to your table." "Actually, David," said his voice remaining perfectly calm, "I think this concerns me directly, especially since Emma and I are getting married next month." The words hit me like lightning. Next month we'd talked about a summer wedding, maybe fall. What was he doing, you see? David continued, addressing the room now rather than just my father. "I've been watching this family dynamic for 2 years. I've seen how Emma's accomplishments are minimized, how her contributions are dismissed, how her worth is measured by standards that don't apply to her chosen profession." Nathan Brooks shifted uncomfortably, clutching his legal documents. Judge Mitchell was watching with sharp interest, his lawyer instincts clearly engaged. "Mr. Chen," my father interrupted, "I appreciate your concern for Emma, but family business should remain private." "Should it?" David asked, pulling out his phone. Because I have a recording from last year's Christmas dinner where Emma mentioned her Teacher of the Year award, and Victoria responded by saying anyone can teach elementary school children. Would you like me to play it for everyone? My heart stopped. He'd been recording family gatherings. Victoria's face went pale, and I saw Amanda flinch. That was taken out of context, Victoria said quickly. Was it? David asked. How about the recording from Emma's awards ceremony last May? The one you missed because you had a golf tournament, but then spent an hour at the country club bar telling people that Emma lacks the ambition gene that runs in successful families. The ballroom was dead silent now. Mrs. Patterson was nodding grimly, and I could see other parents at nearby tables exchanging meaningful looks. My father's face was turning red. You recorded private conversations without permission. That's illegal in Colorado. Actually, David said calmly, Colorado is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's perfectly legal. I've been documenting this pattern of emotional abuse for quite some time. Emotional abuse. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Now see here, Nathan Brooks interjected, his lawyer instincts kicking in. These are serious allegations being made in a public forum. You're right, David agreed. They are serious. Emma has spent her adult life trying to earn approval from people who have no intention of giving it. She's been gaslit into believing her accomplishments don't matter, that her career choice makes her less valuable than her stepsister. Amanda looked mortified, glancing between David and me with obvious distress. Emma transforms children's lives every single day. David continued, his voice growing stronger. She stays after school without pay to tutor struggling students. She spends her own money on classroom supplies. She has a master's degree in education and has won every teaching award the district offers. But tonight she gets a modest educational fund while Amanda inherits a $50 million company. The contrast was stark when laid out so plainly. Several business associates were nodding thoughtfully, clearly seeing the disparity. What's your point? My father demanded, but his confidence was wavering. My point is that you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life, David said quietly. Because you're undervaluing the most remarkable person in this room based on her salary instead of her character. His phone rang. He glanced at it and something flickered across his expression. Excuse me, he said. I need to take this. He stepped slightly away from the table, answering in a voice too low for most people to hear. But I was close enough to catch fragments. Yes, the final documentation is ready. The announcement can proceed as planned, after midnight confirmed. When he hung up, he looked directly at my father with an expression I'd never seen before. Calm, confident, and somehow dangerous. Actually, William David said, using my father's first name with casual familiarity, there's something else we need to discuss. About appropriate levels of contribution, and who really deserves respect in this room. The way he said it made everyone lean forward slightly. Even Judge Mitchell was paying close attention now, his experienced eyes noting something in David's demeanor that suggested this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. My father seemed to sense it too, because for the first time all evening he looked uncertain. But before David could say whatever was building in his expression, my father stepped closer to the microphone, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. His face was flushed, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. I think that's quite enough, my father said firmly. This is neither the time nor the place for personal grievances. We're here to celebrate family and business success, not to air private matters. The crowd murmured uncomfortably. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, probably recording this unexpected drama. Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head in disgust, and several other parents looked genuinely upset on my behalf. Victoria moved to stand beside my father, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm in a show of unity. Her smile was brittle but determined. William is absolutely right, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. Some people simply don't understand their place in life. They create drama instead of accepting reality gracefully. Her words hit me like a slap. I felt tears threatening behind my eyes, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break down. David took a step forward, his expression darkening. Reality, he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Let's talk about reality, Victoria. Let's talk about your gambling debts at Black Hawk Casino. Should I share those numbers with everyone? Victoria went completely white. The blood drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. How dare you, she whispered. How dare I? What? Tell the truth. David pulled out his phone again. I have bank statements, casino records, loan documentation. Should I project them on the screen for everyone to see? Nathan Brooks stepped forward quickly, his lawyer instincts in full defense mode. Mr. Chen, you're making serious accusations without proper legal foundation. David smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Actually, Nathan, I have excellent legal foundation. Publicly available gambling records, credit reports, and financial disclosures that Victoria signed when she married William. All perfectly legal to obtain. My father was staring at Victoria with dawning horror. Gambling debts. What gambling debts? Victoria's composure cracked completely. It's not what it sounds like, William. Just a few small losses, nothing we can't handle. $47,000, David said calmly. That's not small losses, that's addiction. The number hung in the air like a bomb. $47,000. No wonder Victoria had been so desperate to secure Amanda's inheritance. This is preposterous, Amanda said, finally finding her voice. You can't just attack my mother in public like this. I'm not attacking anyone, David replied evenly. I'm providing context for why Emma is being erased from her own family. Your mother needs money to pay off her debts, and the easiest way to get it is to make sure you inherit everything while Emma gets nothing. Judge Mitchell was listening intently, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Brandon looked mortified, probably realizing his future in-laws came with more baggage than he'd expected. Even if that were true, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. It doesn't change the fact that Amanda has proven herself in the business world, while Emma chose a different path. Chose, David repeated, and now his voice was getting louder. Emma didn't choose to be dismissed and belittled her entire life. She didn't choose to have her achievements ignored while Amanda's were celebrated. She didn't choose to be seated at the back table tonight like she was some kind of charity case. The entire ballroom was riveted now. This had become the kind of family drama that would be talked about in Denver social circles for years. My father straightened his shoulders, trying to project authority. Regardless of your accusations, the legal arrangements stand. Amanda will inherit Richardson Construction because she's demonstrated the leadership qualities necessary to run a major business. Leadership qualities, David said, and something in his tone made everyone lean forward. That's interesting, William. Tell me, what do you know about the downtown development project you're so proud of, the $50 million contract that's supposed to secure your company's future? My father's expression shifted slightly. What about it? Do you know who your primary investor is? David asked. The one putting up the initial capital that makes the whole project possible. Of course I know, my father said, but he sounded less certain than before. It's Chen Technologies. Some tech company out of Silicon Valley. David smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused. Some tech company, he repeated. That's one way to put it. He pulled out his phone one more time, and I noticed his hands were completely steady. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready for it. Actually, William, there's something I should probably mention. About who I really am. The hotel manager appeared at David's elbow, as if summoned, his face flushed with concern. I watched in confusion as he leaned close to David, whispering urgently, Mr. Chen, I'm so sorry about any confusion tonight. Your usual suite is ready if you need privacy for business calls. Is there anything we can do to make this evening more comfortable? My father's expression shifted from irritation to puzzlement. The hotel manager was treating David like he was somebody important, not just Emma's modest tech consultant boyfriend. That won't be necessary tonight, James David, replied his voice, carrying an authority I'd never heard before. But I appreciate the offer. James nodded respectfully and stepped back. But not before several guests noticed the interaction. I saw businessmen at nearby tables leaning forward, studying David more carefully. Judge Mitchell stood up from the head table, his experienced lawyer eyes sharp with recognition. "Excuse me, David," said, extending his hand toward the judge. "Robert Mitchell, isn't it? We met at the Colorado Bar Association Technology Summit last spring." Judge Mitchell's face lit up with genuine warmth as he shook David's hand. "Of course. David Chen from Chen Technologies. Your presentation on artificial intelligence in legal research was fascinating. Brandon, come meet Mr. Chen." Brandon approached hesitantly, clearly confused by his father's enthusiasm. David shook his hand professionally, but I noticed Brandon's expression change as recognition dawned. "Wait," he said slowly. "Chen Technologies. You're the CEO who just donated $50 million to the University of Colorado's computer science program." The words hit the ballroom like electricity. Whispers started spreading through the crowd as heads turned toward David. Phones were coming out everywhere now, and I realized people were looking him up online. My father's face had gone completely white. "CEO," he repeated weakly. Nathan Brooks was frantically scrolling through his phone, his expression growing more alarmed by the second. He leaned over to whisper something to my father, who looked like he might be sick. "This is impossible, Victoria," said her voice shaking. "He drives a Tesla. He lives in a regular apartment. He's nobody special." "Actually," David said calmly, "I drive a Tesla because I believe in sustainable technology. I live in a penthouse downtown because I prefer city living to suburban sprawl. And I'm nobody special, just someone who's been fortunate in business." But the crowd was buzzing now as people connected the dots. I heard fragments of conversation from nearby tables. "That's the Chen Technologies logo on the development project banners outside. He's worth over $3 billion according to Forbes. Didn't he just buy that building on 17th Street?" Amanda looked like she'd been slapped. Her perfect composure cracked as she realized she'd been dismissive to one of the wealthiest men in Colorado all evening. "This changes nothing," my father said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. "Family decisions are made based on proven leadership, not on who someone's dating." "Actually," William David said, and his tone was now purely business, "it changes everything. You see, Richardson Construction's $50 million contract depends entirely on Chen Technologies' investment. We're not just the client. We're the primary funding source for the entire downtown development." The ballroom fell dead silent. Even the waiters stopped moving. "And here's the thing about our company values," David continued, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. "We believe in supporting organizations that demonstrate integrity, respect for education, and commitment to community service. We tend to avoid partnerships with companies whose leadership shows public disrespect for teachers and family members." My father was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. "You can't be serious," he whispered. David pulled out his phone and showed it to Judge Mitchell, who read whatever was on the screen and nodded gravely. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Mitchell said formally, "I think you need to understand the gravity of this situation, Mr. Chen has the legal authority to withdraw funding from any project that doesn't align with his company's ethical standards." The business associates who had been courting my father's favor all evening were now openly staring at David with newfound respect. Several of them had stood up and were moving closer, clearly hoping for introductions. "Emma," David said, turning to me with gentle eyes, "I should have told you sooner about my work. But I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I own." I was still processing the revelation that my quiet, humble fiancé was apparently one of the most powerful businessmen in Colorado when Victoria's phone started ringing insistently. She glanced at it, and her face went even paler. The caller ID must have shown one of her creditors because her hands were visibly shaking as she declined the call, but it rang again immediately, and then again. David stepped up to the microphone that my father had abandoned, his presence commanding immediate attention from every person in the ballroom. The whispers died away as 300 guests focused on this man they were just now realizing held more power than anyone else in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice steady and clear, "I owe you all an explanation, and I owe my fiancé an apology for not being completely honest about my work. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear over the sound of my own pulse. This couldn't really be happening. My quiet, modest David couldn't actually be a billionaire CEO. My name is David Chen, and I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Chen Technologies, currently valued at $3.2 billion. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Phones were everywhere now, people frantically Googling his name and taking pictures. I saw the flash of cameras going off as the ballroom erupted in stunned murmurs. For the past 2 years, David continued, I've had the privilege of watching Emma Richardson transform children's lives every single day. I've seen her stay late to help struggling students spend her own money on classroom supplies and win every teaching award the Denver School District offers. Mrs. Patterson was beaming at me from her table, tears in her eyes. The other parents were nodding enthusiastically, clearly proud to have their children's teacher finally recognized. I've also watched Emma's family systematically diminish her accomplishments, dismiss her career choice, and treat her like an embarrassment to be hidden at back tables while celebrating mediocrity in expensive dresses. Amanda's face flushed red. Brandon was staring at David with obvious awe, probably realizing he'd just witnessed his future father-in-law humiliate one of the most powerful men in Colorado. Tonight's inheritance announcement is particularly interesting, David continued, because it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of value. Emma creates future leaders. Amanda shuffles paperwork for people who are already wealthy. The business associates who had been fawning over Amanda all evening were now eyeing David with keen interest. Several had moved closer to the head table, clearly hoping for networking opportunities. But here's what makes this evening truly remarkable, David said, and his tone grew colder. The $50 million construction contract that Mr. Richardson is so proud of, the one that's supposed to secure his company's future, exists entirely at my discretion. My father looked like he might collapse. His face had gone gray, and he was gripping Nathan Brooks' arm for support. Chen Technologies has a very simple business philosophy, David explained. We partner with organizations that share our values. Respect for education, integrity in family relationships, and genuine character over superficial success. Judge Mitchell was nodding approvingly, clearly impressed by David's principles. Brandon looked mortified, probably wondering if his engagement to Amanda was about to become a liability. Mr. Richardson, David said, addressing my father directly, you've just publicly declared that teachers are less valuable than lawyers, that service is less important than profit, and that your own daughter is an embarrassment to your family name. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving, frozen by the drama unfolding at the head table. Those values, David continued, are fundamentally incompatible with Chen Technologies' mission. We believe teachers like Emma are the backbone of society, not charity cases to be dismissed with modest educational funds. Victoria's phone was ringing constantly now. She kept declining the calls, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the device. Therefore, effective immediately, David announced, Chen Technologies is withdrawing all funding from the downtown development project. Richardson Construction's $50 million contract is terminated. The words hit the ballroom like a physical force. Several business associates stepped away from my father, as if he had become suddenly contagious. The networking conversations that had been so enthusiastic an hour ago came to an abrupt halt. Furthermore, David continued relentlessly, Chen Technologies will be reviewing all current and future business relationships with any company associated with Richardson Construction. We take our values seriously, and we expect our partners to do the same. Nathan Brooks was frantically flipping through his legal documents, probably trying to find some clause that could save the situation. But contracts built on handshakes and assumptions wouldn't hold up against billionaire determination. My father finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. David, surely we can discuss this privately. Family disagreements shouldn't affect business relationships. David's smile was sharp as a blade. You're absolutely right, William. Family disagreements shouldn't affect business. But publicly humiliating your daughter while dismissing an entire profession isn't a family disagreement, it's a character deficiency. The crowd was completely riveted now. This had become the kind of public comeuppance that would be talked about for years in Denver social circles. And judging by the panic in Victoria's eyes, as her phone continued to ring, the consequences were just beginning. The cascade of consequences began immediately. I watched in stunned fascination as the business associates who had been eager to network with my father just minutes earlier suddenly found excuses to drift away from the head table. They moved toward David instead, like moths drawn to a brighter flame. "Mr. Chen," said Robert Morrison, Amanda's boss at the law firm, stepping forward with obvious deference. "I had no idea Emma was your fiancé." Morrison and Associates would be honored to discuss any legal needs Chen Technologies might have. The irony was brutal. Amanda's own boss was now courting David's business, while she stood frozen in her red dress, watching her professional world shift beneath her feet. "Actually," David replied coolly, "Chen Technologies already has excellent legal representation. We tend to work with firms that share our values regarding professional integrity and family respect." Morrison's smile faltered as he realized the implication. A glance at Amanda, then at my humiliated father, and he stepped back into the crowd without another word. Victoria's phone was still ringing relentlessly. Finally, she couldn't ignore it anymore and answered with a shaking voice. "Hello, no. I can't talk right now. What do you mean payment is due immediately?" The arrangement was for next month. Her voice carried further than she intended in the quiet ballroom. Several guests turned to stare as her composure cracked completely. "I don't have $47,000 right now," she hissed into the phone. "The family restructuring hasn't been finalized yet." David heard every word. So did Judge Mitchell, whose expression grew increasingly concerned as he watched the drama unfold. Victoria hung up and immediately her phone rang again. This time she turned it off completely, but the damage was done. Everyone now knew the exact amount of her gambling debts. Nathan Brooks was frantically whispering to my father, probably explaining the legal implications of losing their primary investor. Richardson Construction's entire expansion plan had been built around David's funding, and without it, they faced potential bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Patterson had stood up at her table, her face flushed with righteous anger. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "I think everyone here should know what kind of teacher Emma really island." David stepped back from the microphone, allowing her to approach. Mrs. Patterson took the stage with the confidence of someone who had fought school board meetings for years. "My daughter Sarah couldn't read when she entered Emma's second-grade class," Mrs. Patterson announced. She had been labeled as slow, difficult, a child who would probably need special education forever. The crowd listened intently, as other parents began standing up throughout the ballroom. "Emma didn't give up on Sarah," Mrs. Patterson continued. "She stayed after school every day for 3 months, worked with her on weekends, even came to our house during her summer break to help. By Christmas, Sarah was reading at grade level. By the end of the year, she was advanced." Tom Patterson joined his wife at the microphone. "That's not unusual for Emma," he said. "She's done the same thing for dozens of children over the years. She sees potential where others see problems." More parents were moving toward the front, now creating an impromptu testimonial for their children's teacher. I felt tears welling up as I realized these people valued my work more than my own family ever had. "My son Michael was failing math until Emma taught him," said another mother. "She didn't just help him with numbers, she helped him believe in himself." The business associates were watching this display with growing interest. Here was a teacher being celebrated by an entire community, while the lawyer daughter they'd been courting all evening stood silent and increasingly irrelevant. Judge Mitchell stepped forward, his authoritative voice cutting through the emotional testimonials. "Mr. Richardson," he said, formally addressing my father, who looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. "I think it's important that you understand what's happening here." My father looked up, hopefully, probably thinking the judge would restore some sanity to the situation. "Your daughter Emma has just been publicly endorsed by some of Denver's most respected families," Judge Mitchell continued. These are people who vote, who serve on school boards, who influence community decisions. Meanwhile, you've just alienated one of Colorado's most successful businessmen. Brandon was standing beside Amanda, but I noticed he had stepped slightly away from her, probably reconsidering his association with a family now facing financial ruin and social disgrace. From a purely practical standpoint, Judge Mitchell continued, "You've destroyed your company's future, damaged your family's reputation, and lost the respect of everyone in this room. All because you couldn't recognize the value of the most accomplished person at your own table." David's phone buzzed with what seemed like the 100th call of the evening. This time he answered it publicly. Chen speaking. "Yes, I'm aware the news is spreading quickly. No, there won't be any reconsideration of the contract termination. Values alignment is non-negotiable for Chen Technologies." He hung up and looked at the crowd. "Social media is already picking this up," he announced. "The hashtag Teachers Deserve Respect is trending nationally. Emma's story is resonating with people across the country." I realized that this wasn't just a family drama anymore. This had become a symbol of something much larger, a public reckoning about how society values teachers and education. And my father, who had worked his entire life to build a reputation for success, had just become the face of everything people despised about elitism and family dysfunction. For the first time in my adult life, I found my voice in that ballroom. Not the quiet, apologetic voice I'd used to avoid family conflict for 28 years, but something stronger, clearer, filled with the dignity those parents had just shown me I deserved. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. My legs were shaking, but my resolve was solid as granite. "Dad," I said, and my voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "For 28 years, I've tried to earn your approval. I changed my major from art to education because you said teaching was more practical. I stayed in Denver instead of taking that job in California because you said families should stay close. I've spent my entire adult life trying to be the daughter you wanted." My father's face was ashen, but he was finally listening. "Tonight you told 300 people that I don't belong at your level of success. But you're wrong. I don't belong at your level of character." The words felt like freedom leaving my mouth. Years of hurt and disappointment crystallized into perfect clarity. David stepped beside me, his presence steady and supportive, but this moment was mine to claim. "I teach second graders to read," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "I help children who stutter find their voices. I take kids who've been labeled as failures and show them they're brilliant. That's not a consolation prize career, that's a calling, Mrs. Patterson started clapping slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Other parents joined her, and soon half the ballroom was applauding while my father stood frozen at the head table. David moved to the microphone one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to announce the establishment of the Richardson Foundation for Educational Excellence, named in honor of Emma Richardson, not William Richardson." The crowd murmured with interest as David continued. "Chen Technologies is committing $50 million to support teachers across Colorado and beyond. Emma will serve as the foundation's director, finally receiving the professional recognition she's always deserved." $50 million. The amount my father had just lost was being redirected to honor my name, my work, my values. Amanda approached me hesitantly, her perfect composure cracked and vulnerable. "Emma," she said quietly away from the microphone, "I'm sorry. I've known this was wrong for years, but I was too scared to say anything. Mom was so desperate about the money, and I thought if I just stayed quiet." She trailed off, tears in her eyes. For the first time, I saw her not as the golden child who'd stolen my father's affection, but as another victim of Victoria's manipulation. "I'm sorry too," I said, meaning it. "You didn't create this situation. You were just trying to survive it, same as me." We hugged briefly, two sisters finally honest with each other, while our parents' world crumbled around us. Judge Mitchell approached David with professional respect. "Miss Chen, I'd be honored if you'd consider me for the Foundation's legal counsel. Pro bono, of course. This is exactly the kind of community service the Mitchell family believes in." Brandon nodded eagerly beside his father, clearly relieved to be associating with the winning side of this family drama. David smiled. I think that can be arranged, Your Honor. Meanwhile, Victoria had disappeared entirely, probably fleeing to avoid her creditors. Nathan Brooks was packing up his legal documents, the inheritance restructuring now meaningless, without any inheritance to restructure. My father stood alone at the head table, abandoned by his wife, his business associates, and his lawyer. The man who had worked 30 years to build an empire had watched it crumble in 30 minutes. He walked toward me slowly, his usual commanding presence replaced by something fragile and uncertain. Emma, he said, his voice barely audible. I never meant for this to happen. Yes, you did, I replied, but without anger now. You meant for me to disappear quietly while Amanda inherited everything. You meant for me to accept being treated like a disappointment. You meant for all of this, Dad. You just didn't expect consequences. He nodded slowly, the fight gone out of him completely. Can we fix this? He asked, desperately. Can we start over? I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my pain and self-doubt and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of peace. Maybe someday, I said. But it starts with you understanding that respect isn't something you give when it's convenient. It's something you build through consistent action over time. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake David's hand or congratulate me on the foundation. The same people who had barely acknowledged my presence 3 hours earlier now treated me like someone worthy of attention. But the validation that mattered most came from Mrs. Patterson, who hugged me tightly as she prepared to leave. I'm proud of you, sweetie, she whispered. Not just for tonight, but for every single day you've shown up for our children. That was worth more than all the inheritance money in the world. 3 months later, I was standing in my classroom at Lincoln Elementary, watching my second graders practice their reading presentations when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Richardson Construction declares bankruptcy, following contract losses. The headline didn't bring me the satisfaction I might have expected. Instead, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. David knocked on my classroom door holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that gentle smile that still made my heart skip after all these months. The kids looked up from their books and several waved enthusiastically. Mr. David called out Marcus, one of my struggling readers who'd made incredible progress this year. Are you here for our reading celebration? I wouldn't miss it, David replied, settling into one of the tiny plastic chairs while I finished helping Sarah with a particularly challenging word. The transformation in our relationship had been remarkable. No more secrets, no more walking on eggshells around my family's dysfunction. David was exactly who he'd always been, just with more zeros in his bank account than I'd realized. After school, we drove through downtown Denver, where construction had stopped on the massive development project that was supposed to be my father's crowning achievement. Empty cranes stood like metal skeletons against the sky monuments to misplaced priorities and broken trust. David reached for my hand as we passed the abandoned site. Any regrets, he asked. About what? About your father losing everything. About Victoria disappearing. About how it all ended. I considered the question seriously. My father had indeed lost everything. The house had been sold to pay debts, and he'd moved into a modest apartment across town. Victoria had left Colorado entirely after her gambling debts became public knowledge, and their divorce had been finalized within 6 weeks. No regrets, I said finally. Actions have consequences. He made his choices. We pulled into the parking lot of the community center where the Richardson Foundation was holding its first grant ceremony. Inside, 50 teachers from across Colorado had gathered to receive funding for their classrooms, their continuing education, their innovative programs. Mrs. Patterson was there with Tom beaming as she watched me address the crowd. Several of my former students had come with their families, now in 3rd and 4th grade, but still eager to hug their former teacher. Emma, said Jennifer Walsh, a kindergarten teacher from Colorado Springs, these supplies are going to transform my classroom. My kids will finally have the books they deserve. That's what this is all about, I replied, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with money or recognition and everything to do with purpose. David stood at the back of the room watching with obvious pride as I presented grants and listened to teachers' stories. Judge Mitchell was there too, having become one of our strongest advocates in the legal community. Amanda appeared beside me as the ceremony wound down, looking different somehow. Less polished, more genuine. "How are you doing?" I asked, meaning it. "Better," she said. "I left Morrison and Associates last month. Started my own practice focusing on education law and child advocacy. It turns out representing teachers pays a lot less than corporate law, but it feels more meaningful." "I'm proud of you," I said, surprised to realize I meant it completely. "Brandon's still adjusting," she admitted, with a rueful smile. "Turns out dating the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt construction company isn't great for political aspirations. But he's learning what really matters." A month later, David and I were married in a small ceremony at Lincoln Elementary. My students decorated the gym with handmade flowers and banner that read, "Best Teacher Ever Gets Married." Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire service. My father came sitting alone in the back row. He looked older, smaller somehow, but he'd made an effort to be there. We'd spoken twice since New Year's Eve awkward conversations where he'd tried to apologize and I'd tried to find forgiveness. It was a process that would take time. 6 months after our wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. David was beside himself with joy, already planning how to baby-proof his downtown penthouse and researching the best preschools in Denver. "You know our child is going to have teacher parents, right?" I teased him as we looked at the ultrasound pictures. "They'll probably think everyone's family talks about educational theory at dinner." "They'll be lucky," David said seriously. "They'll grow up understanding that success isn't about money or status, it's about making a difference in the world." The Richardson Foundation had grown beyond anything we'd imagined. Teachers from across the country were applying for grants, and we'd already funded over 200 classroom projects. The ripple effect was extraordinary. But the most meaningful moment came when my father called to congratulate us on the pregnancy. "Emma," he said, his voice uncertain but sincere, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built. The foundation, your marriage, the way you've handled everything. I was wrong about so many things." "Thank you for saying that, Dad," I replied, one hand resting on my growing belly. "It means more than you know." As I stood in my classroom that Friday afternoon watching my students pack up their backpacks and chatter about weekend plans, I realized that everything I'd ever wanted was right here. Not at the head table of some fancy party, not in my father's approval, but in this room full of young minds I helped shape every day. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The hardest lesson I learned through all of this wasn't about standing up to family bullies or finding my voice in moments of crisis. It was about recognizing my own worth before anyone else could validate it. Looking back now, with my daughter sleeping in her nursery down the hall, and David working quietly in his home office, I realized that the real transformation happened inside me, not in that ballroom. If you're watching this story and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, dismissed for your career choices, or made to feel like your accomplishments don't matter because they don't come with a big salary, I want you to know something important. Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to see it. It exists whether they acknowledge it or not. The Richardson Foundation has now funded over 800 classroom projects in 42 states. We've provided continuing education scholarships to hundreds of teachers, emergency grants for supplies, and mental health support for educators facing burnout. But you know what makes me proudest? Last month, one of my former students became a teacher herself. She wrote me a letter saying that I showed her teaching was a superpower, not a consolation prize. That letter is framed in my office right next to a picture from that New Year's Eve party. In the photo, David is standing at the microphone while I'm in the background, finally visible after years of being hidden. But what strikes me most about that image is my expression. For the first time in my adult life, I look like someone who knows her own value. My father and I have slowly rebuilt some kind of relationship. It's different now, built on boundaries instead of desperate hope for approval. He comes to Emma Grace's birthday parties and occasionally joins us for Sunday dinner. He's learned to ask about my work, to listen when I talk about my students, to acknowledge that success comes in many forms. Victoria never returned to Colorado. We heard through mutual acquaintances that she's working as a receptionist in Phoenix, finally getting help for her gambling addiction. I hope she finds peace, though I don't miss the toxicity she brought to our family. Amanda and Brandon got married last year in a small ceremony that felt more genuine than any of the elaborate society events we used to attend. She's built a successful practice, representing teachers and families, often working with cases the Richardson Foundation refers to her. We've become real sisters, finally united by understanding instead of divided by competition. The most surprising development has been watching my father learn to be a grandfather. Emma Grace adores him, and he's gentle with her in ways he never was with me. Sometimes I wonder if seeing love without conditions through her eyes has taught him what he missed with his own children. But here's what I really want you to understand from my story. Toxic family dynamics don't heal overnight, and sometimes they don't heal at all. Setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. Choosing your own definition of success over someone else's expectations isn't selfish, it's survival. And sometimes the family you create matters more than the one you were born into. David and I are expecting our second child in the spring, and Emma Grace is excited about becoming a big sister. She's only 2, but she already shows signs of inheriting both of our stubborn streaks. I have a feeling she'll never let anyone make her feel invisible. The Teachers Deserve Respect movement that started with that viral video has grown into something beautiful. Educators across the country have shared their stories. Communities have rallied to support their local schools, and respect for the teaching profession has genuinely increased. Sometimes the most personal battles become the most universal victories. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I'm grateful. If you've ever faced similar family dynamics, please know that you're not alone. Share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family approval and self-respect? How did you find the courage to set boundaries with people you love? Your stories matter, and they help others who are facing similar struggles. And if you're a teacher watching this, thank you for everything you do. Your work matters more than any boardroom deal or legal victory. You're shaping the future every single day, and that's not ordinary. That's extraordinary. Please subscribe for more stories about finding your worth, setting healthy boundaries, and creating the life you deserve. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. And remember, you deserve to be celebrated for who you are, not tolerated for who others want you to become. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well surrounded by people who see your true value. And that's exactly what I intend to keep doing.